When Robert F. Kennedy Jr. stepped into the dying town of Millbrook, he didn't expect an old farmer's final words to ignite a battle against corporate greed. What happened next would not only change the fate of the town, but challenge the very system that had silenced them for years. The road into Millbrook was cracked and dry, stretching toward a town that had once thrived on rich farmland and endless fields of golden wheat. Now, the land looked tired, dusty, brittle, and broken. The river that once nourished the town had turned a sickly shade of brown, carrying the stench of chemicals from the nearby processing plant. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. stepped out of his car onto the main street, where a group of weary but determined townspeople had gathered. They held signs, "Clean water is our right," "Stop poisoning our land," and "Justice for Millbrook." Their eyes, filled with both hope and exhaustion, turned toward him. Among them stood Sarah Miller, a middle-aged woman with sun-creased skin and worry etched across her face. She stepped forward, gripping his hand firmly. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Kennedy. My father, he doesn't have much time left, but he needs to see you." RFK Jr. nodded, feeling the weight of their trust. As Sarah led him toward the old Miller farmhouse, he could hear the whispers behind him. "He's our last chance." The air smelled of dry earth and distant rain. Too late for the crops, but maybe, just maybe, not too late for justice. The Miller farmhouse sat on the edge of a once thriving field, now a barren patch of land dotted with withered crops. The wooden porch creaked under RFK Jr.'s step as Sarah pushed open the door. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood, medicine, and something deeper, an unspoken sorrow. John Miller lay in a narrow bed by the window, his body frail, his skin pale like parchment stretched too thin. His breathing was slow, labored, yet his eyes remained sharp, filled with the same fire that had kept him fighting long after his body had begun to fail. Sarah knelt beside him, her voice soft. "Dad, he's here." With a trembling hand, John motioned for RFK Jr. to come closer. "I didn't think I'd live to see someone who actually gave a damn walk through my door," he rasped, his voice barely louder than the wind rattling the shutters. RFK Jr. pulled up a chair, leaning in. "I'm here to listen, Mr. Miller. Tell me what happened." John coughed, then took a slow breath. "This land. My father worked it, and his father before him. For generations we drank from the river, watered our crops with it, let our cattle graze in the fields it nourished. Then the plant moved in. At first it was just rumors. Kids getting sick, crops dying for no reason. Then it got worse. My wife, my neighbors, we all started getting these strange illnesses. The doctors called it bad luck. We called it poison." His fingers clenched the thin blanket over him. "We fought, we begged, we proved it was the water, but they had money, and we had nothing but our voices. And voices, Mr. Kennedy, don't carry far when the ones listening have their pockets lined." RFK Jr. exhaled sharply, anger tightening in his chest. It was a story he had heard before: communities poisoned, voices ignored, justice delayed. But looking at John Miller, a man who had given everything for this fight, made it feel more personal. "You did everything you could, Mr. Miller," he said, his voice steady. John gave a tired smile. "Not everything. Not yet." With a shaking hand, he reached for a stack of papers on the nightstand. "This is the last petition we sent to the courts. The company's been stalling. I won't be around to see how this ends, but someone has to keep the fight going." RFK Jr. took the papers, his grip firm. "You have my word. This isn't over." John nodded, his breath unsteady but his expression peaceful. "Then maybe, just maybe, I can finally rest." RFK Jr. stepped out of the farmhouse, gripping the stack of petitions as if they were John Miller's last words. Outside, the townspeople had gathered, their faces filled with the same mixture of hope and despair he had seen too often. They had been fighting for years, their voices drowned by corporate greed and bureaucratic silence. He turned to Sarah. "I need to see the river." She led him down a dirt path toward the water's edge. The once clear stream was now sluggish and murky, thick with an oily sheen that shimmered under the gray sky. A few children stood on the bank, staring at the water but never daring to touch it. "We used to swim here," Sarah murmured. "Now, even our cattle won't drink from it." RFK Jr. crouched down, running his fingers through the soil near the water. It was damp, but the smell, chemical, unnatural, confirmed everything John had said. He stood, jaw tight. "We're taking this to court. No more delays." A voice cut through the air. "That's a bold promise, Mr. Kennedy." RFK Jr. turned to see Alan Greaves, a corporate representative from the processing plant, standing near the road in a pristine suit. His smirk was practiced, his stance relaxed. "You're new here, so let me explain how this works. We've conducted our own tests, and there's no conclusive evidence linking our facility to any contamination. The courts have ruled in our favor before, and they will again." RFK Jr. didn't flinch. "Tell that to the families who've lost their loved ones." Greaves chuckled, shaking his head. "You're fighting a losing battle, Mr. Kennedy. This town is dying. If you really cared, you'd help them move on instead of filling their heads with false hope." RFK Jr. stepped forward, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "Clean water isn't hope, Mr. Greaves. It's a right. And no matter how much money your company throws at politicians and lawyers, you won't silence the truth forever." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Greaves's smirk faltered for the briefest moment before he scoffed and walked away. But the damage was done. RFK Jr. had made his stand, and the people of Millbrook knew he wasn't leaving without a fight. As he turned back to face them, he held up John's petition. "This isn't just about Millbrook. This is about every town, every family that has been ignored. We're taking this all the way." The townspeople erupted into cheers. For the first time in years, they felt something stronger than anger or fear. They felt hope. That night, as rain finally began to fall over Millbrook, RFK Jr. returned to the Miller farmhouse. The old wooden floor creaked beneath his steps as he entered John's dimly lit bedroom. Sarah sat by her father's side, holding his frail hand. His breathing was shallow, his once fiery eyes now barely open. RFK Jr. knelt beside him, placing the petition gently on the nightstand. "John, I've spoken to the people. They're ready to fight. And I promise you, we won't stop until we get justice." John's lips curled into the faintest smile. With great effort, he turned his head toward RFK Jr. "Good," he whispered, voice barely above a breath. "I always knew. It would take someone like you." His hand trembled as he reached for RFK Jr.'s, gripping it weakly. "It was never about me. Never about just this farm. It's about every farmer, every family. They deserve better." RFK Jr. squeezed his hand. "They will get better. I swear it." John's breath hitched. A moment of silence passed, then another. His chest rose one last time, then stilled. Sarah let out a quiet sob, pressing her forehead to her father's hand. RFK Jr. closed his eyes, exhaling as he absorbed the weight of the moment. John Miller had fought to his last breath, but his battle wasn't over. He stood, looking down at the petition, now John's final testament. He picked it up and turned to Sarah. "We start tomorrow. No more delays." The next morning, the town gathered in the church hall. RFK Jr. stood before them, John's petition in one hand, a stack of legal documents in the other. This fight doesn't end with John Miller. His battle is now ours. The company thinks they can stall us, silence us, but we're taking this to court. We're going to win." A murmur spread through the crowd, growing louder, stronger. People who had once felt powerless were now standing shoulder to shoulder, ready to fight. From the back of the room, a weathered old farmer stepped forward. "John fought for us. It's time we fight for him." RFK Jr. nodded. "And we will." That night, as the first legal filings were submitted, a candle burned in the window of the Miller farmhouse. A small, flickering light in the darkness. A symbol that John Miller's fight would never be forgotten. Months passed, and the courtroom battle unfolded like a war of endurance. The corporation's lawyers threw every legal obstacle they could, stalling proceedings, challenging evidence, and attempting to discredit the townspeople. But RFK Jr. and his team pushed back, armed with science, testimonies, and relentless determination. The turning point came when Sarah Miller took the stand. Her voice, steady but filled with emotion, painted a vivid picture of what her father had endured. The land he had cultivated, the river he had trusted, and the slow, painful reality of watching his home and health wither away. "My father spent his last breath fighting for this town," she told the jury. "He believed in justice. And today, I ask you to believe in it too." The courtroom fell silent. Even the corporation's polished lawyers seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats. 2 weeks later, the verdict was announced. The company was found liable for water contamination and ordered to fund a full-scale cleanup of the river and surrounding farmland. A multi-million-dollar settlement was granted to the families affected. When the news reached Millbrook, church bells rang for the first time in years. People gathered in the town square, hugging, crying, celebrating, not just for the victory, but for the memory of John Miller. RFK Jr. stood by the river, now flowing clearer than before, watching as workers began the cleanup process. Sarah joined him, her father's old hat in her hands. "He would have been proud," she said, looking out over the water. RFK Jr. nodded. "He didn't just fight for Millbrook. He fought for every town that's been ignored, every family that's been silenced. This is only the beginning." Months later, a small bronze plaque was placed near the riverbank. "In memory of John Miller, a farmer, a fighter, a man who never gave up." RFK Jr. stood before it, knowing the fight wasn't over. There were other Millbrooks, other Johns, other battles waiting to be fought. But for now, here, justice had won. As he walked back toward town, the wind carried a familiar scent, the rich, fresh smell of earth after rain. The land was healing. And so was its people. John Miller's fight for clean water wasn't just about one farm or one town. It was about justice, accountability, and the right to a healthy future. His story reminds us that real change starts with those who refuse to be silenced. Though he didn't live to see the victory, his courage ignited a movement that forced a powerful corporation to take responsibility. At the heart of this battle stood Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a man who didn't just listen, he acted. He faced corruption, corporate greed, and legal obstacles, but he never backed down. His determination proved that when leaders stand with the people, real change is possible. This story is a testament to the power of persistence, community, and truth. It's a call to all of us to stand up, to speak out, and to fight for what's right. If this story inspired you, like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of justice and resilience. Together, we can shine a light on the battles that matter and keep the fight for fairness alive.